we're always in her booth, so you should stop by and see her. And Brian, who's also in my aisle, his first book is out, Children of the Sun. And yours is Slice of Life, and what's the new fantasy series?
There's not, I have 9 books out.
Oh, okay.
But
There you
my newest is the Fire Test. It's a Magic Academy series.
Okay, so according to the description, science fiction doesn't have to be just about space. These authors are going to tell you how they bend the rules of genre to create some of the most entertaining stories in science fiction. So, Ellie, do you want to start? Just kind of say something, or do you want to take questions?
I can start.
Okay, yeah.
I think one of the most important things about building a world is to build the groundwork on which your reader can stand. And whether it is in an actual land in which you describe, like the material things, that can be the groundwork in which the reader can stand and feel comfortable. It could be that land, or it could be a character. So a lot of science fiction will open up with a character, who knows nothing or has been shocked, like all of a sudden in a new world. Well, now that character is who you are standing on. So you can introduce as much mystery, as much, unrealistic, unexplained phenomenon that you want to, as long as you have that one thing, which has to be substantial, on which your reader can stand on. So I highly recommend being able to define that in whatever science fiction you're writing. And you'll be able to see that in almost all science fiction movies and books.
Everybody has their preconceived notions of what each genre is supposed to be about. So one thing that I've run into with my novel is a lot of my novel, 2/3 of it is set on Earth. So a lot of people who I've run into have said, well, yeah, it's not a different world. And, well, yeah, but you didn't create this whole new, basically a construct, a different type of life and creatures in the world. Science fiction is not necessarily have to be a different world. And that's one thing that has been a challenge for me. When I was in Southern California writing screenplays and people would read my screenplays, the problem I had with Children of the Sun was sci-fi people would say, yeah, but there's not enough sci-fi here. And other people said, yeah, this got sci-fi in it, and I don't want it. And so there was always that challenge of preconceived notions. What are you building? So, like she said, you can start with, you're the writer, you can start with your own world, you can create it. But if you choose to start with Earth, with what we have today, you can still have a sci-fi story. First one that comes to mind for me every time is Terminator. Terminator isn't set in space. Terminator doesn't have anything to do with anything except a futuristic world meeting our world today. And you can go any direction you want, but the element of sci-fi is the science fiction. And that's sometimes what you're confronted with is people's preconceived notions, and that's been a challenge for me.
So, what would be the difference in terms of world building? I mean, how do you decide what to use, what not to use? Time to time.
Yeah. You have to cut, basically. You're going to fall in love with a lot of things about your book, or even as a reader, if you are a sci-fi reader, then you're gonna fall in love with certain things in the series, and you need to realize kind of your strengths as a writer. If your readers or your beta readers or your editors are loving your world building, then you can realize that you can take a bit more time, explaining and delving into these worlds. If you're fast-paced action, then you are not going to slow down to explain the banking system, unless they're robbing the bank. I'm an editor as well. I've been an editor for 7 years, and when I go through every scene, beginning, middle, end of the scene, it has to have a goal. And if these sci-fi worlds are meandering, then I'll cut it out no matter what. You have to focus on that goal of the scene. So you basically aren't supposed to fall in love with anything because it might be getting cut.
Hi. I am Kevin J. Anderson. And we've discovered that this room is not exactly 2205B. 2205B is on the other side of the river. But I come bringing Todd Mccaffrey, so I should be welcome.
That's right, Kevin J. Anderson, Todd J. McCaffrey. You see, we stole middle initials.
There's a J consistency. So you're done with the panel. Thanks, everybody.
We were talking about,
We were talking about you the whole time, actually.
Well, good.
Why isn't he
Lots
doing
of
that?
people talking about me, yes.
world building and the choices you make and what to include.
I do things that are unstable so I can blow them up. And I have done so. I have a high celestial body count. Right.
Yeah, I think in world building, one of the things that fans love is to know exactly where things are when they want to do things like build games and mushes and moves off it. But writers, we kind of want to keep everything vague so we can blow it up later or add that room you never saw before, all those good things. So world building, the general rule is generally you build only as much as you need to show it, just a little bit more so you know what's off in the corners.
But you do need to know how it works. And there are, a very specific thing is like your generic, the bad generic fantasy novels that were coming out like the 70s and 80s, where the wizard had the magical spell of convenience. That there were no really defined magic rules. It's just the giant monster came up and he had I have the rune up against giant monsters that he just comes up with. And I like to build, like I'm my Seven Sons series or the Dune series I worked on with Brian Herbert, just building the foundation and the cultures and the ecology and the science and the astronomy and all that stuff helps you build your stories. In fact, it's developing the world that helps me develop my characters and the stories, because I'll come up with some interesting weather pattern or something that then you start building backward. In fact, the story I'm working on right now, which is a prequel to the Saga of Shadows, they're on this isolated planet where I wanted a cyclical, like 7-year locusts, only they're spores. The mushrooms are spores that come up every 7 or 8 years, and they happen to be toxic. And the colonists are there, but they happen to come in between, so they don't know what's coming up. And they're starting to, what I needed to have was something so that a few of them come up and they determine that they're poisonous and they have to do something about them before the other billion of them hatch. And so I'm having to, that's my story, and I'm having to back plot and back develop this fungal fruiting creatures or whatever, and I haven't quite worked it all out yet. That's what I'm working on now, but I know what the story is, so they have to develop the biology so that it fits with the story, because it all has to fit together at the end.
And I think Ellie hit on a key point earlier when she said that it's a matter of pacing. How deeply do you want to get into a subject and distract the reader, or is it really important that you do have to explain something so that the reader understands? It's all a matter of pacing. And so if you slow the reader down at a key point and go into too much detail, and what she alluded to earlier, then you're going to lose the reader's interest. And so it's all a matter of that individual story. One story you may handle one way, and another story you're going to handle a different way. It all depends upon that pacing of that story, because there's two main things: the story and the character. Your reader's got to love that character, and your main character got to care about him, and they got to keep the interest of the story. So I think you hit it on that. The pacing is what's key.
I would also just urge, each of you to remember what you love. You know, like as you're reading, whenever you get completely sucked into something, then remember that, because that is what you will draw from as an author or as a fan. And whenever you're reading a passionate a book by a passionate author, I mean, you know it, you feel it. You're like, this is story. This is coming from, you know, this personality, this character, or, you know, if it's really well written, you won't even think about the author, and you'll just say like, this story is grabbing me. But you have to do what you love. So, you know, those spores are integral to his plot. You know, so he has to develop that. But the city that it takes place in, he might not develop at all. I don't know, because that doesn't matter. But these spores matter. And so as you're writing and something just kicks you, it could be a spiritual experience that your character had. It could be a romance that develops between two characters. It could be a special, you know, watch. It could, whatever it is that just kicks you, write what you love. Don't write like what you should do. And then it's completely okay to not explain those things. Like my Silver Sickle takes place on a Sand Kingdom mountain, which is completely powered by this underground steam system. I never explain it because it doesn't matter in my story. You just have to accept it.
Well, and that's something you have to keep in mind. Just because you've worked out all the details doesn't mean that your character knows about it. Right. One of the examples is you're writing a young adult story where the prom queen or the beautiful cheerleader can't get a date to the prom, and she gets dressed in the morning, and she puts on her makeup, and she's got her dress, and she's got to go out and flirt with guys to figure out who's going to ask her to prom, and she puts her coffee in the microwave and pushes the start button, at which point the microwave frequency radiation oscillates the water molecules in the coffee so that the friction warms them up by thermal conductivity. And no, she doesn't know how a microwave works, so you don't have to explain how the microwave works. She's worried about something else. And too many writers get so enamored with their world building that they feel that they have to lecture the readers. They'll go through the entire blueprints of how your underground steam system works when all she's trying to do is get a date for the prom.
Right. Yeah, 90% of everything you know should not be on the page. You should only put about 10%.
So I guess that kind of answers the question I had next, which was how much science is too much science. So we've already gone there.
Well, it depends on what kind of book it is too. If you're Tom Clancy, you better damn well know how the submarine works.
But you may not have to explain it to me.
Oh, yeah. So one of my favorite examples of that. Who's seen the movie Inception? Okay. Do you remember that 5-minute scene of exposition where Leonardo DiCaprio takes the little intern into the dream world and explains it for 5 minutes, even though we've already been in the dream world? That is my like go-to example of exposition that we didn't need, because everything else he had explained through action already. Those words did not need to take place. So if you can explain something through action, boom, like you got it. If you're ever typing up some exposition, ask yourself, like, have I already explained this through action, or can I explain this through action? Because it is so much more natural.
And as an author, you're going to have some readers who really want to know, but they're only going to be a few. I know I had someone come up to me and say, well, do you explain how the laser guns work? Nope. Because it doesn't matter. And then I got a lecture on how hyperdrive is different than warp drive in Star Wars and Star Trek.
Well,
But I'm not going into that, okay? I'm not going into explaining. That's not what the story is about. It did not matter to the reader. And you may have somebody every once in a while who cares about that. But they're going to either hate your story, or they're going to move on to somebody else. And you can't help that. But the overwhelming majority of the readers is whom we're addressing here. that they're not going to care if it doesn't matter, like your example with the microwave. It doesn't matter. You might have 1 or 2 people, you can't help that. There's always going to be the one-offs. What matters is the majority of your readers.
Super obvious mistakes whether or not you know the guns is a huge example. And I will confess, I have gone to firing ranges, I really don't know anything about guns, but I do know that the cop who shoots the bullets out of his revolver doesn't slam in another clip when he's done. There are writers who do that, and they get screamed at by the gun nuts. I'm not meaning anything disparaging by gun nuts, so don't shoot me about it. But there are people that really, really obsess on the details of the firearms in your books. So if you're going to have a cops and robbers thing where people are shooting at each other, you should at least figure out what kind of guns they're using and minimally how they work. Just 2 nights ago I was watching the 2nd season of Daredevil on Netflix. Yeah. And there's a scene on the rooftop where the Punisher has got Daredevil chained up and the Punisher's just lecturing. Well, it's on a rooftop. He's
getting chained up.
So, but the Punisher is this long monologue and they're talking, and the whole time he's doing this, he's like stripping and reassembling these massive semi-automatic rifles. And I'm watching the actor going, in my mind I'm thinking, I would have no clue how to put these pieces together. And he's doing this all as he's just talking, and I don't know that many audience members really paid attention to that, but the fact that he's focused on talking, and this is very emotional lecture that he's doing, and he's just like instinctively reassembling all these very complex pieces and slapping them together, and the sound effects guy was making all of the cool gun noises as they click and clack together and stuff. But if you are dealing with something that is heavily related to firearms, you need to, there is a very large part of your readership that really, really, really already knows way more than you do.
So the key is then, and because I'm in complete agreement, as I am a gun guy, get it right. If you're going to go down that path when you're writing something, get it right. And if you don't need to go down that path, don't. And so if writing that scene, if he were writing that scene, he wouldn't go into detail, he wouldn't need to. He would just allude to the fact that he disassembled and reassembled for the purpose of cleaning or something's jammed or whatever. He doesn't have to go into deep detail. Whereas somebody else, if they know that, then that's up to them. That's completely their fault.
Yeah, I was just, you reminded me of a line that threw me out of a book. It was actually Dan Brown's book, I think it was Angels and Demons. And our guy is flying on a hyperspace plane, or hypersonic plane, that was loaned to him by NASA to go fly to CERN, and he's reading the instructions on the how to use the low gravity toilet, and then the paragraph ends with, little did he know, which, okay, never, little did he know, never do this. Little did he know that in 30 hours this would save his life. Bad idea, you know? Do not do this, please, ever. I stopped reading the book right there. I was like,
little did he know that he would kick the reader right out.
So if you don't need to go into that detail, don't. And if you don't know, don't go down that path.
On the other hand,
I think that's what you're pointing at.
And horses is another one. Oh man, I did a book called The Trinity Paradox, which is an anti-nuke protester goes back in time to the Manhattan Project and tries to sabotage the development of the first atomic bomb. And she's in Los Alamos, and I've worked at Los Alamos. I spent years studying the history of the Manhattan Project and the German nuclear program, the development of this. I knew all the scientists, I know all the nuclear physics, and I knew all the work that was going on. And there's a scene where this is in Los Alamos, New Mexico, in the mountains of New Mexico, and there's a lot of the Bandelier National Monument, there's a lot of Indian, like Mesa Verde type Indian ruins that are there. And Oppenheimer used to go and ride his horses up in one of the Indian ruins. And our character decides that the way she's going to stop the atomic bomb from being invented is if she can just kill Oppenheimer. So she goes to try to ambush him while he's riding his horse. And again, I spent years researching the Manhattan Project and the physics and the research and the physicists and everything else. And I got an angry letter saying that I had saddled my horse wrong.
Also, that was probably my wife.
There's some easy giveaways, you know. We can do starships today. We can do hyperspace today. We can jump to warp speed. We can jump to light speed. Those are all giveaways, so there's no real reason to explain them. You can run with them, and most fans will go, okay, that's fine.
I wouldn't know how to anyway.
What? To jump to light speed?
I wouldn't know how to explain it.
Oh, okay. Well, I mean, but some of us can. You know, that's the other thing. You can always find an expert who will be 100% wrong about anything.
Yes. Well, and you mentioned the warp drive and the hyperdrive, and in Star Trek, I really believe that Mr. Scott and Geordi LaForge understood how the warp drives worked.
Well,
I did not believe that Han Solo really knew how the Vulcan worked, that it worked, because I don't know how my car works. I turn the key and it goes, and I go somewhere.
They actually did a whole thing about how warp drive is supposed to work in the Starship Enterprise. I was appalled.
That's called too much time on their hands.
Yeah.
Well, so far out of the panel, I've gotten that it doesn't matter.
Any questions?
I mean, you know, like, yeah,
I know.
Little did he know, 30 hours from now. But, you know, that's a classic example.
I need to write that down too. So
Yeah.
never use little did you know.
Yeah.
Do you guys have any questions? Yeah.
Hard sci-fi, soft sci-fi. Everybody has this conversation.
There you go.
Well, define hard and define soft.
You do.
Well, okay, so there's so many different gradations on hard science fiction. The general rule, or one of the general rules I heard about what science fiction was supposed to be is everything that we know today plus one impossible thing. Now some people said 2 impossible things, 3 impossible things. Yeah. Softer science fiction is, we think we can do this, we don't know how. Star Trek is soft science fiction, very soft science fiction. As a matter of fact, Star Trek starts moving over towards what I call rubber band science. You know, it's as simple to explain as how you use a rubber band. Yes?
So I guess my question is, so let's say we take The Expanse, and the book series that was written on, right? You have something that's what people would call hard sci-fi, everything we know, one thing we don't. And there's this entire bunch of stuff we already know as readers. It's not that far-fetched. And then you go to Star Trek, and you have warp drive, and escape pods, and artificial gravity, and all these things we may have to. Do you have any experience in writing between the two of them? Is there difficulty? Is it easier to write hard sci-fi under that description of hard sci-fi?
I would think that well, there's a couple of questions. I think the first question you really want to answer when you're talking about writing is, what do I want to write? You know, if you're a person who loves knowing how nuts and bolts go and how things work, then you're probably going to gravitate more towards hard science fiction. It also depends upon what sort of story you want to tell. You know, I tend to work from my characters, and so that'll influence what the story I want to tell. If I want to have characters doing fantastical things, I'll do a fantasy. If I want to have them do hard science things, I'll put them in a different setting. But some people like to start with their world or their universe and move on from there. So they build a universe like spores on a planet and figure out what they're going to do with it. It really depends upon where you want to go. Some people say, well, I have to write hard science, so I'm going to go this way. Anybody else want to throw an answer on that one?
Well, I'd say something about The Expanse is that looks hard science fiction, but it's not, because it's about the people and the stuff that they're doing. It's not about how the universe works. It's not like Isaac Asimov wrote science fiction where the story wasn't about how the science worked, and the characters were just basically people who talked about how the science worked. Peter F. Hamilton, who was one of my favorite big science fiction writers, has kind of lost me because he has developed his series of, I forget what it's called, it's this immense series that he's got, that he's legitimately postulated what human beings and what society will be like several hundred years in the future, and they are almost unrecognizable and unrelatable, and he's probably fairly accurate. But accurate is one thing, storytelling is another thing. And he's got everybody, because there's, like right now we have the internet and everything, so he's got sort of everybody mentally connected with stuff, and you can access, you can Google search just by mentally doing stuff. I believe that's probably going to happen in a couple of centuries, if not faster. But he's got everybody who's using all this stuff, and it's just lost. It's not relatable anymore because they're not normal people. My science fiction series is a lot like The Expanse. It looks science fiction-y on the outside, and you can argue with me whether that's an accurate postulation or not, because our technology should be way advanced beyond that. But I want to tell a story that people can actually read, because stories aren't meant to predict the future, they're meant to entertain you and tell you stories, and we're using window dressing that should be interesting.
Well, we can also use stories to raise questions. So we can throw out there, well, what happens if you have an artificial intelligence, for example? Shameless plug of my book.
What's that book called, Tom? Wasn't it City of
It's
Angels?
called City of Angels.
I thought so.
Oh my God, who published it? Wordfire Press.
And where is it available?
And where is it available? It's available upstairs at the Wordfire booth. Yay! Okay, thank you.
Which is listed in your program.
Number 723 if you don't want to look it up.
You said the word easy, and that just made me think to just remind everyone here, this is art. Art is the most subjective thing. So, you know, Michelangelo could not have done what Jackson Pollock did, and Jackson Pollock can't do what Monet did. And as an author, you're not writing what's easy, you're writing who you are, you know, you're bleeding on the page. And so you can't, and then this is another thing, like you can't write outside your mind. And so the way that your mind works is all this like character-driven story, and then there's one, you know, far-reaching element like a zombie apocalypse, which is science fiction. Then that's you, and it's going to be easier for you because you're writing, you know, and you guys are creating art every time you create something out of nothing. You know, every time you sit at that computer. So what's easy to one person, you know, that's not the correct word. This is also subjective.
I would also tend to argue that zombie apocalypse is fantasy. So potato.
It's science fiction in Amazon, so.
Yeah.
And we know that Jeff Bezos and Amazon never did anything.
That's cool.
Because he's
Just
categorizing all
to
himself.
make a very quick point to what you were saying. What matters to me is, can I entertain my audience with the story that I've thought of? And I'm not a futurist. I'm not writing nonfiction. I'm not writing to educate anyone. If I happen to educate a little bit, okay, fine, but that's not where I'm going. I'm going just to entertain. That's all it's about to me. Questions?
Right here.
One of the things that I was thinking about was that if it's like a fiction story about science, but does it still count as sci-fi, if that makes sense? Like, for example, The Martian. A lot of people can argue that it's not really a sci-fi story because it could happen today and there's not like that one element. Yeah, right. Not me, but some people argue that.
There are people who say, well, it's good and it was successful, so it can't be science fiction.
Right.
I had an argument in high school with my teacher who insisted that 1984 and Brave New World were not science fiction because they were good. That's bullshit.
Yeah.
The Martian is a certain kind of science fiction in the same way that The Expanse is a certain kind of science fiction and Star Trek is a certain kind of science fiction. We've taken over the world, guys, so too late.
The Martian is a very good example of what most people would call hard science fiction.
Yeah.
You know, it is a very good example of it. We don't, you know, we have some impossible things. We haven't put humans on the moon yet. Right now, that's technically impossible. Excuse me. The converse thing to remember is that science fiction turns into fantasy. It always must, because after a while, we move forward, and what we thought was fact is no longer fact. Facts age out. We used to think that the moon had a breathable planet, had a breathable atmosphere, and there were canals on it, because we didn't know better. That's what our telescope showed us. So all the books that were written as science fiction with, you know, John Carter of Mars and all that stuff have now become fantasy. So it's kind of an interesting world that way.
Over here.
You were advising earlier to not write too much about subjects you don't know anything about. How do you go about it when there is in fact something scientific that you would like to write about? Do you go to a subject matter expert to help you out, or do you study up on it as a matter of pride or anything?
It depends upon you. I tend to study up on it. but I have a degree in mechanical engineering, therefore I have an ego the size of the planet, and believe I can learn anything. But other people, you know, it is also really helpful if you can find right subject matter people. The other thing to recall is what I think Heinlein said, which is always ask the experts. They'll tell you what you can't do, and then go do it.
And that would be a case too of what I would do is learn as much as possible, and then let someone who does know, and someone who is a subject matter expert, as you say, let them read it to make sure that it comes across right. Let it make sure that it sounded right when I wrote it, but because I don't know, I didn't explain this well enough. And so then that's where that other person or other people come in.
But you're always...
I do it more for inspiration, actually. So it's during the world building process. You know, when I'll read a book about bees, or I'll read a history, you know, telling me about a certain battle that took place. So, and then that will lead me an inspiration to a plot. So usually it's more, for me, all that knowledge is inspiration. It's not like as I'm writing, I'm like, oh, I have no idea about this scene. I like to get my plot from nonfiction.
If you have gone through non-professional editors like Spouse, you have gone through beta readers for both content and grammar, and you've got people that know their stuff with regards to the beta reading. How many of you have used critique groups, and what do you think about them?
Okay, I'm going to give the Todd McCaffrey patented lecture on the writer's dance. Okay, as a writer, we put ourselves, we learn when we write a book. The book is always about a transformation. You know, our characters change, we have to change with them. But we generally tend to want to avoid writing as long as we can. We try and come up with this, you know, if I don't write it, then it can always be perfect thing. So what we do is we come up with a billion range of excuses for not finishing the book and sending it out to somebody who will give you a check for your work, pay you money. So I call this the writer's dance. It may be you get up at 3 a.m. with a toothbrush and clean your bathroom, because of course that's so much more important than writing your novel. It may also be that you send it out to the 50th critique group to see what they think about it. You have to be really careful with this. Critique groups can be great. They can find things that you never thought of. The best advice I heard was from Ann Sowards, who's an editor at, is it Rock? Ace. Okay. And she said, don't go over it more than about 4 times, right? So, you know, if you have spouse, editor, friends, and then critique group, that's 3 times. Maybe 1 more time after that, you're fine. But if you rework the story too much, it goes stale, and it shows up on the page. That's my advice.
And be careful with the critique group, because you got to find somebody who actually knows what they're talking about, because you often have very frustrated, uninspired writers who want to tear you apart because you've written something they didn't. And I was when I started publishing, professionally publishing like short stories and things, I wanted a critique group. I was in the San Francisco area, and I was going to a bunch of cons, and I knew a lot of people, and I said, all right, I want to form a critique group. Who wants to join it? And I got like 50 people. And I went, well, but I want serious people that were kind of had their minds in the right place. So in order to be in Kevin's critique group, you had to have 3 rejection slips. At which point of the 50, 47 of them dropped out. I don't want them critiquing my work if they aren't serious enough to even send their story anyplace. And then I found that when I got the core critique group, and we spent a lot of time reading each other's stuff, and I got a lot of good things out of it. And then I started to become a lot more successful. I sold a novel contract, and then I had a 3-book contract, and then I got a book on the preliminary Nebula ballot. And then all of a sudden, the people that used to critique my stuff very carefully just hated everything I did. They really did. They were like, well, this isn't as good as your other stuff, and they would just tear it to shreds. And I realized that they were just pissed off because they weren't publishing anything, and I was being successful. And then I decided that if I could take that kind of abuse, I'll let my wife give it to me, so she does my editing instead.
Question over here.
Save your money for a professional editor. 100%. Just save your money and get a professional editor.
Yeah. I look at it as this is my voice, and it needs to remain my voice. And yeah, that doesn't mean I'm not open to criticism, but I'm not interested in the critique. I'm interested in being my voice.
Over here.
Do you have any advice for character development for short fiction or flash fiction?
Well, for what kind of development?
Do you have any advice for character development? A lot of short fiction and flash fiction, I have a hard time developing characters because they're so short. So do you have any advice for that?
Well, if you're not showing all your emotions on the page, if you're not crying when somebody dies when you're writing that scene, then you haven't put enough emotion into it. You're holding back. I think it was Richard Christian Matheson who did this beautiful 6-word short story, For Sale, Baby Shoes, Never Used. You know, you can get impact, you can get character development in a very short period of time. It takes, it's a good thing, practice it. It does take practice. It also takes reading a lot of people who've done it, so read more short stuff. But that would be my first advice. You know, read until your eyeballs fall out and then start writing. That's the usual thing. There's a Clarion Writers Workshop as well, Clarion West and Clarion now. And they can be a great place to go to do a sort of a short story boot camp. But that would be my advice.
Agreeing with everything he said, I use something called the I am technique. I basically take on the persona of my character and write down who that character is. I write down I am and give every single possible trait that is going to define that character. And one of the big reasons is if you have a group of characters and any character could have delivered that line, then you have too many characters. And so, yeah, I mean, just put it in simple terms here, if you're writing Star Wars and I am Luke Skywalker, I am immature, and you start going down this path of describing who he is. And I have this for all of my main characters. So then while I'm writing, I will go back to that if sometimes I think, okay, wait a minute now, am I still being true to this character? And I go back and I read the I am this person, I am this, I do this, I do this. And it helps me get back into the mindset of that character. And to me, it's been the most valuable thing that I have been taught in how to maintain my characters.
I would also add the Blake Snyder thing. And those of you who haven't seen Blake Snyder Save the Cat, you might want to look at it. It's a great series. More for film. But one of the things he talks about is 6 things that need fixing in your main character. So you start the book, your character's got flaws, and along the way, they work the story, they start getting rid of them. In a short story, you may have to cut that down a few more, but I like the notion of 6 things that need fixing. And I also cheat. I use astrology, you know, for different characters. Like, oh, well, this character is a Libra, and I can go look at what traits Libra have. It's good shorthand, very good for minor characters.
Question here.
I want to know how you usually handle cliches. I know a lot of people, including a lot of publishers, will tell you avoid them like the plague. Is that a rule that you generally follow, or do you sometimes use them just to get a point across?
I think if you're going to use a cliche, it's probably best to use it in a 3-time slam. And try and twist it at the end. So that you hit them with the cliche once, and people go, okay. Hit them with the cliche twice, now they know you're using a cliche. You hit them a 3rd time with a twist. It's like, oh yeah, okay. But usually you want to avoid them. You also want to avoid repetitive phrases. Also, please, please, please think about the voices of your characters. If you have a character who comes from a place that was founded by the Russian Federation, and you know, Russia's mostly, we can talk about how happy people are in Russia, which is not. And you come from another place, which is France, and you come from a 3rd place, which has a British background, please don't have them all use the same dialogue. I'm not saying dialects. You know, don't do the whole abbreviated stuff, but dialogue. You know, the French guy will say probably some version of sacre bleu or merde, you know, and you can translate that however you want. But they will have a different catchphrase when they're behaving and when they're reacting than the British guy who said, oh, jolly good show, whatever. There'll be a difference. Please keep the difference. I don't want to know that we've expanded to the universe and there's different cultures out there and everybody talks with the same frickin' accent. It's all North American. It's like, why? Why not save yourself, you know, use it?
Like, absolutely use it. Like Stephen King, he says, you know, write it the simplest way that you can. They're words, so use them. You know, like, it means be aware of it, though. So, you know, whenever you do write a cliche, I mean, really, like, I would just say that, like, it's a very subjective, and your editors are going to catch it. So, like, don't overthink it. You're just writing the story, and there might be a scene where it just fits perfectly. You know, like Madeleine L'Engle, she started her book with "It was a dark and stormy night." Like, okay, like.
Yeah, but she wrote that long enough ago that it probably wasn't a cliche, did it?
No, it wasn't a cliche by then.
The
Like,
last
she did
camel
it
by
on
then.
purpose. So you do your story, and then pay a professional editor to catch all your crappy writing.
Well, don't rely on editors. I'm not disparaging editors. I think they're great, they're marvelous, but even they are human. You know, they usually put on the pants the same way I do, get shot out of a cannon, fall on the pants on the way down. But they do make mistakes, so you want to be as good as you can be. In the White Dragon, the Todd Mccaffrey book, this is way back when, in the days of typewriters and carbon paper and all that stuff. And so in those days, before they printed the first books, they would send you back what's known as the galleys, which are these big long sheets. They're actually 3 pages on a sheet. And she had my sister and myself reading through the galleys along with her to try and catch stuff. So we had 3 sets of eyes in our house. There were proofreaders, there were all sorts of stuff. There was the editor, and we get the book, and we almost did the standard classic rule, which is whenever you write something and you get the first copy of it, you will open it to the page, to the only page with the worst typo possible. That's just a rule. Just, you know, learn to live with it. But the other one we found was we had gone through this thing very carefully, and we get it, we start reading it, we realize that we have Jackson finding a clutch of eggs on page such and such, and then Jackson finds a clutch of eggs on page so-and-so, and then the same thing. You know, and there were at least 15 people that read that.
That's not a typo.
Well, it's not, it's a mistake, but you know, it happens. And that's so many different editors were through it, so many other people. So what I said to Mom, the consoler, was, well, maybe you found 2 clutches of eggs. What the heck? But it happens. So you can't say my editor is going to catch everything or my friends are going to catch everything. So just, you know, it's part of the art. Accidents happen.
I think Ellie's answer goes to, I'm going to say something different. It goes to everybody's different. I stay away from cliches in the narrative voice. If my character uses a cliche, fine. But then that character is probably going to use multiple cliches throughout the story. And you know, it's a difference we have that just goes to show that there's going to be some things that you may go against the convention, or you may go against what somebody else does. And if that's who you are, that's no problem. But just be forewarned that, as she mentioned, that a lot of editors are going to not be happy.
No, there's more though to just cliches as far as in your writing, because there's cliches in your plotting and your characters too. I mean, there's the hi, I'm this young guy and I just turned 21 and I've got married and my wife's going to have a baby and I'm going to go with our cops out to a shootout. You know the guy's dead. And my beloved mentor that I would never suspect anything of, that I've told him about the big plot in the government, turns out to be the guy who betrays you. These cliches are plot things over and over again, or your best friend or your partner, and any cop show you find, you know who's going to die just by looking at the cast of characters.
Women.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Or Sean Bean.
So those sorts of things, it's a different, well, red shirts is a very perfect example, that it wasn't a cliche at the time, but we all know that if you're the security guard in the red shirt beaming down to the planet, you're dead.
Yeah, I just finds out his wife's pregnant.
Yeah, so that's the sort of thing that in writing you want to avoid, but Hollywood seems to love it. And we were, I went with a group of writers to see, it's truly a brilliant movie called The Last Action Hero with Arnold Schwarzenegger, okay? And it is all about cliches. And we were in the movie theater watching it, and my 5 writer friends and I were laughing ourselves sick. Everybody else in the audience was dead silent. Like there's one scene where the cops go and there's a bomb rigged and they open the door and the bomb blows up and one of the cops, he's found hanging from a tree dying and his last words are 3 days till retirement, and he died. They're all laughing, and this guy next to me shot me this glare and said, "What are you laughing for? That's sad." There are people who don't get it, so you know you can't play. And the cliches, Charles Dance, who's the bad guy who's in the movie world, and he comes back out into the real world, and he comes out and he meets some thug on the street, and he shoots him dead, and he shoots, and then he listens for the cop sirens, and he went, "Well, where are the cop sirens? I just shot this guy." And he says, "Hello, I just shot somebody, and I did it on purpose." And he's waiting for the cops to instantly arrive the moment that he shoots, because they're from the movie world where cliches actually happen. And that really, the last half of the movie falls apart entirely because they decided to make it an action movie instead of the cliche movie. But the first half of it is full of exploring cliches. I mean, Arnold walks into his apartment, turns around and fires bullets into the closet, and this bad guy falls out. And the kid says, "How did you know there was a guy in the closet?" And Arnold says, "There's always a man in the closet." If you want to understand that movie, and there's the chase scene where the guy on the bicycle gets hit and he falls over and the bike explodes because it is full of cliches and it pokes fun at them. So if you aren't aware of cliches, watch that movie, and if you think any part of it is really sad, you're not seeing the cliche.
We have time for one more really quick question. Right here.
How do you know when you've done enough world building?
A quick question.
Well, I have this book on world building at the Wordfire booth, which is, what is it?
723?
Actually, I have given a bunch of lectures and classes on it, and finally I wrote it up into a book where there's a whole bunch of ask this question and figure out this part. You don't have to do that for flash fiction, obviously, but I just wanted to drop that if anybody wants those things. But again, remember, it's the story, not the world. And building the world drives the story and the characters. So what you need is to tell your story and to have your characters. And if you get to the point where, I had this argument with Jerry Purnell where he's insisting that fantasy is easy to write and science fiction is hard. I've written both. And I started writing this big epic fantasy with sailing ships and sea monsters, and I realized that I'm writing science fiction and it's great because I can just make up the plasma iron or whatever when I'm building something. But when I'm doing this fantasy with sailing ships and sea monsters, I went, crap, how do they make the rope? And I'm in this like desert Arabian country that has a bunch of wooden ships. Well, where the crap did the wood come from? Do they have gunpowder, and do they have the printing press, and do they? How do they make the fabric for the sails? And where all of that stuff is a question that I had to answer. Where science fiction, you just go, well, it's mer silk from Melgon 4. That's where it comes from.
It always comes from Melgon 4.
Yeah, it's a very good planet.
Yeah. The other thing is that you want it. Your world building should not be another part of the writer's dance. I know a lot of people are sitting there on, chapter 540 on their world building Bible. Mistake. Don't do it.
Yep, you're done when you have a cohesive story.
Usually it says the end. Which I think we're out of time. Yeah. So thank you all for coming. Please visit the, go ahead.
I have a raffle going on at my booth. I would love it if all of you came, signed up. You get the entire series and you get some artwork. My booth is 1743. And then I'll also have the raffle with me if if you want to just do it here.
Go see her, and then I'm across the aisle.
And these guys are at 723.
It's the Tower of Mirror. It's this gigantic tower in the middle of
His
Florida.
face is at the top.
And if you don't like me and Todd, we've got Jim Butcher there signing at 2 o'clock today.
Thank you all very much.